Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to, this is my second session chairing around national governing bodies. And this particular one, I'm really excited about. So it's about sporting heritage and disability. We also have an aspect of women's, which is coming later. But this session is specifically about disability. And just for those that don't know me, my name's Julia Lee. I'm going to be chairing this and hopefully not saying much. But my background is rugby league, and I've been working alongside the sporting heritage team to collect the history of national governing bodies and bring sporting histories alive, of which this project over the last 2 years has really begun to bring alive some absolutely fantastic stories that are going on. This work was to work with small national governing bodies to establish and understand their heritage collections, with an emphasis, particularly, as I say, on women and disabilities, but this session is particularly about disabilities. And we'll talk about the successes, the challenges, and the future of heritage in national governing bodies. So over the last 2 years, myself and Bridget Powers, who I'm hopeful is listening, she said she might do, have contacted over 120 national governing bodies to engage with them. 85 of them now have their own sporting heritage website, which is really exciting. And we have a thriving Heritage Champions Forum, which I chaired yesterday, talking to some of the champions. And as we have begun to uncover the historic gems, we've developed podcasts, educational resources, exhibitions, and developed a toolkit to support them through their heritage journey. So the whole aim is to empower the national governing bodies to become custodians and to disseminate in their own heritage, in their own language, in their own way. There is opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to hear from the 3 people who I'll introduce in a minute. So in the chat, please feel free to ask questions, because I know there might be lots outgoing there, because they're going to give you lots of information coming up. So I'm really pleased. We've got Vicky Hope-Walker, who's the Chief Executive of the National Paralympic Heritage Trust. We've got McGeough, who's the Chief Executive of Paradance UK, and also Kathryn Fielding, who's the Senior Development Officer of Goalball UK, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the past 2 years. So without further ado, rather than me sitting here and chatting and it's being all about me, I'm going to first of all introduce Patrick, and he's going to give us 5 minutes. But first of all, I believe we've got a couple of minutes video to introduce what Paradance is all about. Thank you.
Or make figures of 8 with my wrist. If I turn my head to the beat. If I tap one toe, or move just one finger, or raise my arms to the chorus of a song. This is my dance.
Thank you. As Julia said, my name is Patrick McGeough. I'm the Chief Executive of Paradance UK. We're a national body and charity covering paradance sport, which is competitive ballroom, Latin and freestyle dancing, which is recognised under the International Paralympic Committee as a sport, but also is it's not a Paralympic Games sport. So there's a slight definition tweak between there, but also that we're a national charity covering inclusive dance. I think from Paradance UK's point of view, our whole mantra and engagement with the community is to give people an opportunity to try dance, because everyone has this idea that dance is a particular style or a particular way of working. And I think we want to show that actually it doesn't matter if it's Zumba, hip hop, street, contemporary, musical theatre, that there's an opportunity to give everyone a chance to be active, socializing and creative in dance, and get involved in dance in a multitude of different ways. I think Paradance has been, well, we have been going since 2006. And since 2006, we gathered a collection of different ways of working in dance. And I think for us, there are key elements of, as you're talking and engaging people, it's about, for us, the ethos about ensuring that dance is equal, it's safe, it's dignified, and above all, it's fun for everyone to take part. And I think we want to change hearts and minds in actually saying to people, you don't always have to do the main big sports. Sometimes just turning on the radio and boogieing for 5 seconds is just as good as potentially doing a full gym run or a run around the park, or playing tennis or playing football. At the end of the day, dance is something that can really engage and empower people. And hopefully we can, during this conversation, show that some of the work that Paradance has been doing to inspire and engage more disabled people to get involved in the community.
Thank you, Patrick. And I know that boogie in the kitchen is quite regularly me. And I know we've had many conversations. I'm known as a big dancer, of which my friends never appreciate when I'm on a proper dance floor. So doing it in the kitchen is probably safer. But I just know in our engagement and the history, although you've just said it was 2007, it goes back so much more. So we'll have a discussion about that later. So thank you for that introduction. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Vicky Hope-Walker, who's the Chief Executive of the National Paralympic Heritage Trust, to just tell us a little bit more about the work that she does.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here. Before I do that, I've just got to say, Patrick, there's a piece of equipment that was invented in the engineering department under Gutman, sat behind me, called Possum, and it enabled people through breath, and then later on through, maybe they just had the movement of a toe or a finger, and there was a choreographer and she could only move her big thumb, that was it. But you know what, with that equipment that was invented under him, she went on to do choreography still. So you just reminded me of that in your lovely film. Yeah, I'm Vicky. I run the Paralympic Heritage Trust, and as you can see from the paraphernalia behind me, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and do a little presentation for you. The trust is relatively new, really, and it was set up in 2015, and we were set up to to kind of look after and share the Paralympic heritage that actually wasn't being looked after or shared. It was still in hospital and sporting kind of storerooms. So we're now in our 5th year going, and I've got a couple of old photographs here. You've got one of Gutman in front of the old Stoke Mandeville Games sign, which the Stoke Mandeville Games is what became the Paralympics. And the stars represent the number of countries that were taking part in the Games at the time. And his very famous quote, if I ever did one good thing in my medical career, it was to introduce sport into the rehabilitation of disabled people. At that time, it was all wheelchair sport. It wasn't until the 1970s that other disability sports started being introduced. But that's not to say that those sports weren't up and running in many cases prior to wheelchair sport. So why do we do it? We're doing it because our collection is a really fantastic way of challenging negative perceptions of disability, so through that Paralympic heritage. And despite a lot of positivity around London 2012, there's still a really uncomfortable, awful amount of hate crime towards people with disability. And it's a long journey, and one that all of us, you know, are embarked on and determined to keep tackling. So a big part of our work is obviously collections. We're aiming to be an accredited museum and going through that process at the moment. We've got all sorts of things from early photographs to mystery object on the desk, which if any of you can guess, maybe towards the end, we'll see if you're right. Piece of medical equipment, I should say. So from old photographs and films to the latest paraphernalia from Tokyo, through to the apple there with the wheelchair user on the top of it is actually a model for the set design for London 2012. So a whole variety of both cultural activity, sporting activity, equipment, outfits as well. The other major thing that we set out to do was have a Paralympic Heritage Centre, a small museum, and here is the entrance to it at Stoke Mandeville Stadium, which is considered the birthplace of the Paralympics. That opened in March 2019, and we've since opened displays actually at the spinal unit itself. Here are some of the displays, and the one thing that really was of major concern to us was making sure everything was accessible in the broadest terms across many disabilities, and getting it right. What I discovered is that I would never get it right, but there was means and ways of keep on improving. We also have done regional exhibitions, and we have virtual versions of all of our exhibitions. This is one at Cartwright Hall in Bradford, where we kind of share the national story, but then the local venue puts in all of their local Paralympic and disability sport history. And we're creating a completely virtual version of this now, so that any venue, sporting or a museum, could be part of that. And then, of course, learning is a huge part of what we do. And we have a really exciting program that's involved in careers development, people interested in heritage careers with disabilities, through to reaching out to schools and local communities, and a lot of interpretation of the heritage through the voices of the people who experienced it. So lots of oral histories and co-curation going on. So that is a brief introduction to what we do.
Thank you, Vicky. That was a real whistle-stop tour, because I know you've got so much that you actually do as part of the Heritage Centre, and I'm so hopefully looking forward to, because I've been doing this now 2 years, and of course because of COVID not being able to actually physically go and see anything, so I'm hoping that I can eventually go around and see all the different museums and centres. And I think you're tapping into the virtual. It seems to be a common theme through this conference around, you know, how people can access our heritage virtually and how important that is. So thank you very much for that, and I'm looking forward for digging a bit deeper into more things, particularly the mystery object, which if people want to put in the chat what they think the mystery object, that would be interesting, and then we can see at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to, Kathryn and I met about a year ago, and I discovered the joys of goalball and the absolutely amazing goalball community that there is and the history behind it. So introducing Kathryn Fielding, who's the Senior Development Officer for Goalball. And I think, again, we're going to start, all these films give me goosebumps when I see them. They're only for 2 minutes, but I get real goosebumpy. So first of all, Kathryn's going to open up with a video, and then she's going on to talk a bit more about goalball. Thank you.
Goalball was devised in 1946 as a rehabilitation activity for visually impaired World War II veterans. It was introduced to the world at the 1976 Paralympic Games in Toronto and is played by both men's and women's teams. Goalball is exclusively for athletes with a visual impairment. To be eligible, athletes have less than 10% vision remaining or a visual field restricted to 20 degrees. Participants wear blackout masks whilst on court that cannot be touched unless permitted by the referee. The court is 18 metres by 9 metres. Each team's goal stretches the entire width and is 1.3 metres high. The hard rubber ball has a diameter of 25 centimetres. Two bells inside the ball help orientate the players of the direction of the oncoming ball. The string placed under court lines also give the players orientation. Whilst play is in progress, complete silence is required in the venue to allow the players to react to the ball. The object of the game is to roll the ball into the opposite goal, whilst opposing players try to block the ball with their bodies. There are 3 players per team on court at any time, with a maximum of 3 substitutes. Each match consists of 2 12-minute halves separated by a 3-minute break. Teams have 10 seconds from first offensive contact to get the ball across the centre court line. The game is won by scoring the most goals in the allotted time, or if one team leads the other, by 10 goals. A tournament begins with a round-robin phase. The top 4 teams from each group will progress through to the quarter-final and semi-final elimination matches as they strive to reach the final. Goalball is unique. The hush of the crowd and the high degree of skill, tactics and split-second player reactions create a spectacular sport.
Morning everyone. So that video hopefully just gives you a bit of background to the sport, as well as how it's played. So the opening lines, I think, explained that it was devised after World War II as a rehabilitation exercise for World War II veterans who had been blinded, and it's been in the Paralympics since 1976. So a lot of people are not aware of that, but a lot of people are not aware of the sport, full stop. So we always have to kind of start off explaining what it is. The key characteristics are that the ball is audible, so the players track it by sound rather than sight, and the court is tactile, so the players orientate themselves and move around the court using touch rather than vision. That's kind of the dynamics of the sport. We hope that one day we won't have to always begin with explaining what it is. The likes of sitting volleyball, wheelchair basketball, blind football, you might not know these sports inside out, but you can have an educated guess if you know what volleyball is, if you know what basketball is, if you know what football is, you can probably have a good idea of what the adaptation is for the specific impairment. So in terms of my role, I've been involved in goalball for almost 20 years now, both in paid roles and volunteering. In the nicest possible way. Once you get into the sport, you don't get out and you end up doing it 8 days a week, but it is good fun. My day-to-day role is nothing really to do with heritage. It was just kind of a bit of a personal passion and a bit of a rainy day project, or should I say COVID day project, being sat in my front room rather than being out in sports halls delivering. We've started to try and archive and kind of get the history of the sport. So ordinarily, my role is very kind of diverse. I cover a lot in terms of content and also a lot in terms of geography, because we do cover the UK. I support new and existing clubs, both on and off court. So that's not just coaching, but also helping with the club structure and making sure there's, committees are in place and they're reaching minimum standards, things like that. I deliver taster sessions, so that can be within schools, colleges, universities, to community groups such as Cub Scouts, Brownies, things like that, to sightless organisations. So we might go along to specific open days or family days linked to an eye condition. I also do team building days. So if anyone's interested after today to learn more about goalball, have a go at goalball, we can arrange that for you. It's a great team building activity, because what I should have said is that yes, at Paralympic level, all the athletes are visually impaired. But below that, anybody can play because everyone wears eye shades. So there's nothing stopping a group of sighted people playing goalball. I also recruit and train coaches and officials, because like any sport, we need a workforce to be able to deliver it. And then I support our national competition. So we have 3 levels of play. We have novice, intermediate and elite, which are hopefully self-explanatory. Novice level, we have 3 leagues. Intermediate, we have 2. And then elite, we just have the 1 level. And on top of all that, when I've got nothing else to do, I sit or try and raise awareness of the sport. So that'll be going out to events and exhibitions and days like this, events like this, just to tell people what our mad, crazy sport is all about. Goalball UK in itself only came about in 2010 as an official national governing body. Prior to that, we were under the umbrella of British Blind Sport, and that's since 1976. So it's just making sure people know that there's, yes, my work is about today and tomorrow, so the present and the future. But I think looking back and learning, reflecting on it is really important as well. So that's why I'm trying to incorporate it into everything else.
Thank you, Kathryn. And I think you're a really good example of a lot of national governing bodies, particularly those with a disability, who, one, have only just had their own identity very early, you know, in the 2000s, only being identified as sports within their own right. But also you've got a rich history that's just untold, but also that actually you add heritage to everything else because it's that important. And I think it's just, you're just a really good example of that, of a lot of national governing bodies that are finding that. And as I say, particularly around disability. And it doesn't cease to amaze me that it's taken so long to recognise disabled athletes in this piece of work. So it's my pleasure to really host this, which I guess is where I want to start with my first question, which is around historically, really, where's disability, how is it, or if it has been represented in sporting heritage? And who were the leading components, really, looking at in the past? Vicky, if I just start with you, and then please feel free to chip in, Kathryn and Patrick.
I don't think it has been represented, I'm really honest, at all. It's, you know, it was a great pity, because when we had London 2012, part of the bid was there would be a Paralympic and Olympic museum in the park. And that never happened, and that's still not happened. It might do yet, we never know. But it then, you think it took from 2012 to 2015 for us to set up the Paralympic Heritage Trust. So I think the representation has just not been there, and yet it's a really incredible movement. And it's played an important role both in the broader disability kind of rights sector, and at the same time, it's been kind of fundamental in the development of equipment, in the development of kind of medical equipment, certainly with the spinal injuries and the wheelchair sport. But it's, you know, it's led the way in so many areas. But, you know, the good news is we're there, and we're all here today, and we're moving forward. It's going to be a long journey.
Yeah, Patrick, I know it's similar to Paradance, isn't it? That you had a long history. And I think Gutman, he keeps coming up. This Professor Gutman keeps coming to know what an amazing man he was, realising the value of, you know, so early on physical activity and how it can really enhance, obviously, your well-being, which obviously is very much on the agenda now, but also, you know, can help so often. I think you had the similar things in Paradance, haven't you, or in dance in particular?
Yeah, Paradance, a Paradance sport technically started back in 1970 as wheelchair dancing. And it wasn't until later on into the early 80s, 90s that a group of individuals in Holland decided to adapt basic wheelchair dancing into a more competitive ballroom Latin style program that then progressed on to then work with the International Dance Sport Federation and the International Paralympic Committee to set up the World Paradance Sport Committee internationally. But it's quite an interesting one, because when you come to people, and I as chief exec, I come to them and say, look, this is Paradance sport, and they go, dance. Oh no, that's creative. That's not part of what we do. And then when you look at things like the London 2012 Games, or even any of the Paralympic Games or Commonwealth Games, or anything in regards to bigger sporting events, what's connected to it? Well, it's the entertainment bit, the opening ceremonies, the music, the dance, the speeches, all of these bits and pieces that are so integral into the sport programme, but they're not seen as equal to the sporting programme. So it's seen as, you've done a great performance to open up the London 2012 or the Tokyo Olympics. There was, for the first time, some wheelchair users that were in the dance program that they were promoting. I saw an article recently that they'd finally got wheelchair users in the opening ceremony, and it was a case of, but that's great, but why are we shouting at the fact that they've just got someone performing in the opening ceremony when we look back at the history, it's always integrated? If you look at the opening ceremony at the Paralympic Heritage at Stoke Mandeville, when they open the Paralympics ceremony, there is always disabled dancers and other forms of musicality and dance performance in there. But we don't link. We never link the two together. We keep them so separated. And you can learn so much from the two in terms of moving things forward and seeing the development. And as Vicky said, that whole design of, we can take learnings and developments around what has happened in the past to build the future. But for some reason we don't. We sometimes lock that up. Even today, in these last couple of years with the pandemic, the research and the evidence that's coming out that's proving having hybrid models of using Zoom, whether you hate it or love it or in what capacity, but we're already dropping. I've seen so many people go, but we'll go back to face-to-face working. We're not learning the mistakes or some of the best things about engaging and working with the wider community, not just the disability community, but there are so many integral things that are linked to disability that can take things further forward. But we sometimes just see what's the quick fix, what can we look at next to make it work.
Patrick, there used to be at the early games, they always had a disco and beer tent every night. Maybe we need to bring that back and have the competition in the evening.
Sounds good to me. I'll be there. You may not like the dancing, but I'll be there.
Oh, I'll be there, big dancing as well, knocking them all out with my big wings. Definitely, because it's about feel good, isn't it? It's about feel good and, you know, adding to how people are mental health and well-being.
I think it's also understanding of the disability market. The amount of times, I don't know about Kathryn with Goalball, but Paradance Sports and Inclusive Dance, the amount of times people say, we are fully inclusive. And then I go, okay, what have you got? And they go, well, I've run a dance class or a dance sport class for individuals with learning disabilities for the last 5 years. So I go, well, okay, what about someone with a visual impairment? What about someone who is a wheelchair user? Oh, well, we've never had them come along, so we don't need to worry about it. Why haven't they come along? Why haven't you looked at the provision? And I think there is something learning from history, and especially with sports or activities and sports like ours, where you see that they started off in wheelchair-based. It was a wheelchair-based dance program, and gradually over the years it's opened up, especially in the UK specifically. We've opened up the doors to not just say, okay, we're not just doing paradance sport anymore, we are doing inclusive dance, which means that we are looking at sensory, physical, mental health, learning disabilities. And because you can't turn around to someone and say we're fully inclusive. I don't think I've met anyone that is fully inclusive, because there are so many disabilities out there. There are so many individuals with different needs, abilities, wants. So I think it's an ever learning change, but there are so many things that, as Vicky said previously, that's happened that can build into that. But again, it comes back to that. We don't necessarily talk about what inclusivity means for people and what that means for the physical activity and sport market. I don't know about Kathryn, if you found that.
Yeah, I mean, it's often just clumped together, isn't it? Disability, inclusion, TIC, and it's not. It's such a vast group of people, and it's knowing the individual and knowing what their needs are rather than just assigning them to a label. So the example we often flag up is, you know, a wheelchair user versus someone with a visual impairment. The old example of curbs. You know, wheelchair users hate curbs, they're a pain. You know, visually impaired people love curves because they're a point of reference. They help with mobility, getting around, and it's the same in, you know, sporting context. So even within Goalball, where our primary audience is people with visual impairment, so, you know, are they blind or partially sighted? That difference is important. Do they have an acquired visual impairment, or is it a congenital visual impairment? And it is hard for a sport to be prepared for everything, but I think it's being ready to ask questions so that they can then work with everyone. You know, to have everything in place in advance, you know, options A to or beyond Z is a big ask, but it's just being open to be able to move it on. Even with sensory impairments, again, we sometimes get put together there and very, very different. But then equally, some people will have more than one impairment. There are overlaps. So it's a complex picture. Taking it back to talking about 2012, I think for us, the impact was massive. As a new national governing body, we probably couldn't maximise the opportunity it offered. But I think what was striking was it was the first time that people saw us as an elite sport. Prior to that, it was very much, the perception was, it was quite patronising. It was, you know, poor little blind people having a go at something and didn't they do well? Whereas people came along, saw the goalball and was like, wow, that is physically demanding. That is tactically, technically full on. And if anything, the sport, I wouldn't say it's got easier, but it's evolved from where it started. You know, there used to be a much heavier ball. You know, used to play on any kind of tiled surface, whereas now we quite like to play on a softer wooden sprung floor. You know, people have got protection that they wear, padding. We have the benefit of sports science. So, you know, it's a bit like marathon runners now that have their super duper trainers and all the tech to support them and all the nutrition. For me, the people that went out in a vest and flat pumps, you know, 50 years ago and ran a marathon is greater than the likes of some of the elite athletes do now, who do weeks of training at altitude to perform. So yeah, I think where the sport has come from and what it represented then is very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I can really relate to that. I know in rugby league, we had our first wheelchair rugby league games in the late 1990s when the French came across. And in the wheelchair, we played our international the French v the Great Britain team on a playground in these wheelchairs. And they were just falling all over these playgrounds. But you know, that's where I just discovered the power of sport at all different levels, because the physicality, they were playing as close to the laws of the game as possible. It was just amazing. And my dog's joining in because he agrees with me. I don't know if you can all hear him. But it was just brilliant. But that in history needs to be told, because I think, again, to what all of you been saying, actually, how important history is and how we learn from history of where we've come from to how we then develop in the future is just so important, so that we don't repeat the same things, so that we can actually move things forward. And there's definitely been a step change I've seen in the last 5 years, I would say. And just this Olympics and Paralympics, just seeing the mixture of the diversity, not just disability, but the diversity and the inclusion that has begun. We're not quite there yet, but it's just been brilliant. Vicky.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about the Paralympic sport at the moment is what they're saying is the Olympic sport has kind of plateaued in terms of its audience, whereas the Paralympics hasn't. So I think really the next kind of 4 years and leading up to Paris is a huge opportunity for us to really, you know, sort of do a lot more work and get a lot more out there in terms of that sporting heritage. And, you know, I'm quite conscious that a lot of what we've got in our collection at the moment is very much biased towards the wheelchair sport, partly because those are the collections we've got on the main, not solely. And I think that as an organisation, we have a real responsibility to broaden that out, whether they're collections that we're holding or they're collections still held by other people, but shared through us. I think is really important to kind of move things forward and shift. And, you know, going back to that whole thing of what is inclusion and what disabilities, you know, the range. I said earlier on that I was really determined that we got things right. And then I discovered that actually you don't get things right. And it is one step at a time and improving. And, you know, recently we've had a much bigger push on the sensory side. And one of my team members, Fiona, has created the most amazing sensory workshop. So, you know, and then you think, well, we can improve on that. So not to be put off by getting everything perfect, because that's not possible.
I think that the saying there, isn't it? You won't always get everything right, but don't get anything wrong twice. You learn from it. So
yeah, absolutely.
We're not perfect. So.
And that comes lovely. There's a question from Lizzie Borrell. Hello, Lizzie. Welcome to our session. She's saying that what are your views on the ways in which your sport should be inclusive? For example, disability specific sessions or a disability session for all people. Who'd like to go first?
Go on then, I'll have a go.
Go on.
I think it's speaking to the person. So don't go in there with assumptions in your head. Speak to the person, find out what they're wanting from it. Because something we often get with people is, oh, I'm not sporty. And it's just they've had very negative experiences in school when with a person with reduced vision, they've been in a class of 30 in a P lesson trying to play rugby or football and getting hit in the face by a ball, and it's put them off sport. But then they come to the environment that's right for them, and they excel and say, well, actually I can do sport. And it's a bit like the elitism angle as well. When people think, oh, I've got to be super fit to get involved in sport, you don't. There's a level for everybody. Just give it a go.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I go back to the mantra of Paradance's ethos. We deliver under four main ethoses, which is you treat everyone equally, you make sure it's safe for everybody, you treat everyone with dignity in the respects of that they are coming to learn, or they're coming to have fun, or they're coming to get engaged in that. And then it is about that, having that fun or social aspect to it. At the end of the day, yes, as Kathryn said, is that bit we talk about elite sport and that you've got to get fit, you've got to get active. But about 90% of people that go to sport or fitness activities are going to meet people, are coming to socialize, are coming to have fun while getting active. So I think we always got to remember that it doesn't matter if it's disabled or not, it's about ensuring that it's a safe and fun environment for people to get involved. I think also it's that assumption. The amount of classes I've gone to as a power wheelchair user, and they start the class straight off, fitness class, with take 4 steps to the right. And I just look at them and go, okay, I can't do that. What do you want me to? And I think sometimes it's that understanding the target market you're working to. Not everyone's going to fit a square peg round hole type of affair. So understand the market you're working to, understand that you're ever learning and using organisations like us, like Goalball, like wheelchair rugby, wheelchair basketball, Sense, CP Sport. There's a raft of Wheel Power. There's a raft of organisations out there that support and engage regarding different sports and different abilities and disabilities. I think the other key thing to remember is that disabled people are human beings too. We're not going to bite your head off if we get something wrong. We're more likely to get angry if you patronise us or ignore us. So it is about that two-way communication. If you are having difficulty, ask the questions. We can only give you the answer that we've got, and then work with us to make it work. Because otherwise, if you keep going back and going, it's too difficult, or I don't want to upset them, or I don't know what I'm doing, don't always put a barrier up. Try with the, okay, let's see how we can do it, and go from there, would be my suggestion.
I think it's the individual, isn't it, at the end of the day? We don't put on sporting events as such, because there's organisations like yours to be doing that, and we've worked in partnership with some of you. But what we do with our events is we do have some events which are specifically targeted, be it a British Sign Language tour or a described tour for people who are visually impaired. At the same time, general events, we will have somebody doing BSL, and we will have descriptive text, so that people can choose. Some people with sensory needs need a very special environment, but there might be some people who would rather come to something where everyone has sensory needs, or they might want to come to something more general. So I think to be inclusive, you've got to, whatever you do, you need to think of those individuals, talk to them and find out what their needs are prior to events.
Yeah, just going back to something that Patrick said. So, for example, playing the actual game of goalball, if you are a power chair user who can't transfer to the floor, never mind to your feet, then yes, you are going to struggle to play goalball as it is. but what is the aspiration of that individual? You know, you've got to be honest and say, sorry, you're not going to make it into Team GB, but you are welcome to come along and get involved in the club. And we can look at adapting the sport for you and playing, you know, offering alternative roles in the club as well. And it's not a case of the old, you know, putting the fat kid in goal for football scenario from years gone by. You know, there's genuine roles that they can get involved in with coaching and officiating and just helping, you know, with the dynamics of the game. So never just close the door and say no, always just say, well, no, it may be difficult for you to play, but here are other ways to get involved and learn together.
I think there's that key element, isn't there, about the elite sport versus grassroots sport, because as Kathryn said, with our elite level element of the sport, when you get to Team GB level, there are rules and regulations. The sport has classification, it has anti-doping, it has a raft of things, and I would love to say that the sport would include everybody, but the rules are the rules, and the international bodies set those rules, so we have to follow them. But what we can also do is then, if someone doesn't meet the eligibility to be involved in that elite level element of the sport, as Kathryn said around Goalball, around grassroots opportunities of having different people have a go. That's the point, is that you can say to people up front, look, the rules are rules, these are the elite level options, but as an organisation, we still run grassroots opportunities for you to have a go. In dance, they may, ballroom and Latin may not be their bag. They may prefer to be an adjudicator. They may prefer to be a coach. They may prefer to just volunteer and press the button to play music. It really, there are a raft of different things to look at. I think also the other idea is understanding in the disability world, this whole element of organisations like Goalball and Paradance, where we're seen as specialists. We're only open to that section of the community because that's where we're based. And I would challenge anyone who would come and try Paradance sport or inclusive dance and go, actually, yes, we are specialists in elite and Team GB because we have to be, because that's what we've been told, that's what the rules and the regulations set up for. But I would again argue that 80% of my work is based around working with the general disability population and their carers, their family, the support workers, in having a family dance day. For example, we're running an inclusive dance day on the 10th of November, which is online. It's not open for Paradance sport athletes. It is an inclusive dance parasport program open for the community. And I think we've got to get through this mantra of that we always have to do something specialist or specialised for people. And I think the other key thing is understanding the Paralympic family. We always go to the Paralympic Games and say, these are the sports, these are the programmes, because that's what the TV programmes and the organisations talk about. But for example, like Paradance sport, we're part of the Paralympic family. We're a Paralympic sport. We're not part of the Games, but we're a Paralympic sport, part of that family. And it's understanding that breadth, that Paralympics isn't just always about that 4-year event. There are a multitude of other things that happen that aren't just specialised Paralympics events, that are engagement, family events, community events that involve the wider community looking at physical and sports activities.
It's the equipment angle as well, isn't it? So for you, Patrick, you know, the wheelchair is a piece of equipment which enables a session. You don't have to be a wheelchair user. It's the same for us with Goalball. You know, you have the eye shades. You don't have to have the visual impairment. You do have to play for Team GB. And that's something that we kind of play on a lot, trying to get sighted people involved in the sport. We have a small percentage, and as the game kind of progresses upwards, the numbers tend to drop out because it does get harder as a sighted person to play because you're not used to the intricacies of being under eye shades. But at novice level, we have a lot of setups with families. So we might have parents or partners or siblings that play, and it's this reverse integration. You know, we've got some brilliant case studies from families that say, well, we tried other sports together and it didn't work, but with Goalball we can. And you know, a few examples I can think of, a family that mum and daughter number 1 have same eye condition, but dad and daughter number 2 are sighted, but they're all engaged in the sport. And it's, you know, it's brilliant for doing that, bringing people together.
And I think that takes us also back to the heritage and what we should be sharing and the grassroots. You both kind of mentioned grassroots, and I think we have to celebrate the grassroots, because that is where people come up through the grassroots. And by doing that, and we've certainly done that with the regional exhibitions, you're actually encouraging people to learn about what's available local sports-wise and get involved in it. And going back to Lizzie Borrell's question, I think that, I don't know if it should be interested, but I know that Liverpool University are working on a free disability sport coaching program. And I think they're going to be launching it later this year. I'll try and get some more information so it can be shared through Sporting Heritage, but there might be people interested in doing that and thinking about how they can be more inclusive in the work.
Just to chip in there, it's the Paracoach Conference in Liverpool. It's the 11th and 12th of November. And there's a whole raft of coaches from Parasport that are there talking about their sport and doing demonstrations.
Yeah. Fran or Joe put that in the chat so that people can access it. And Lizzie said that'll be really interesting. I think that would be really interesting. Again, learning from history, isn't it? Learning from what's happened in the past and how we can get better towards now in the future. I know I did some work, part of this project, with the Riding for the Disabled. And their history is just fascinating. In the 1960s, 70s, the reason they were set up is because they wanted to get people out of institutions who were locked up in institutions out, and they thought riding was a whole group of really powerful, empowering women wanted these people to out of the institutions and onto horses. And getting them physical active, and the fact that it was very frowned upon that they would even leave the institutions, but that powerful social history and then the impact that's had and the growth of Riding for the Disabled now and where it is all over the country is just fascinating, and we should learn from that history.
Yeah, and it's the individuals at grassroots level forcing that up and making that happen, and their histories need sharing.
Yeah, Kathryn and then Patrick.
Ability to kind of link in with each other as well, because we often just get pigeonholed, or it's a bit of tokenism. I was involved in a coach mentoring program a few years back, and there was a whole variety of coaches on it, and people got paired off, and at the end it was me left and someone, a local fencing coach, which obviously fencing isn't, a massive participation sport, so we were paired together. And it was, yes, you can learn from being different, but equally, it would have been far more beneficial for me to be paired with, another ball sport and where there was transferable skills. But it was just a bit like, oh, what do we do with this, weird disability sport where it's, drop the disability, we're a sport. So frustrating.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick.
I think again, it comes back to this whole idea. If you even learn from the Tokyo Olympics, Paralympics Olympics this time round, the message and the mantra that's coming out from it is that whole concept that Paralympians are not Paralympians for 4 years. There is a 4-year gap. So they have lives, they do grassroots activities, they go out, they do other bits. And I think that for me is something else that we're learning each time, that process. That if you go back even just 20 years in regards to the Paralympians, and it was like 4 years, yes, there's these fantastic, inspirational, wonderful disabled athletes that are doing, and the mantra and the thinking was that you held these people up as inspirational leaders and individuals, and that they were breaking barriers, and in some instances they were. But as we've grown and as we started to have more, even for example in the last couple of years, last few years, the Channel 4 actually putting the Paralympics onto the TVs, whereas previously it was just the Olympics. So I think there is gradually a slow change, but I think you learn from the previous experience of, as I said, from the Tokyo Games, they're now taking this whole concept of that actually you need to look at that whole period of time, not just the one event. Because if we just continue to just look at that one event, you end up, as Kathryn said, with that silo approach, because you're then saying, well, they're all specialists, they're all inspirational, aren't they wonderful? Great, well, you've got a medal, okay, wait for the next 4 years. Whereas if we have the constant conversations, we have the engagement, we start talking about what the possibilities are, and even things like paradance sport. About 10 years ago, me being even part of this type of event and having dance as a sport and involved, would never have happened. It just wasn't even thought of, because it was seen as creative entertainment, not a sport or physical activity that you could use to empower and engage people. So I think history does have a key point, but I think it's taking those elements of history and putting them forward in a different way, because at the moment sometimes I think we take history and we make it more, isn't it wonderful that Kathryn's come to talk today about goalball, and isn't it wonderful that blind people, that whole partly semantic and patronizing view around disability still stays slightly in the community. And I think what we're seeing is gradually people are saying, actually, no, just the fact I'm playing goalball, or the fact I'm doing paradance sport, or I play tennis or rugby, whatever it might be at the time, doesn't make me inspirational. What it makes me is an individual that wants to be fit, active and engaged in the community.
Giving people confidence as well, hasn't it? I think having that exposure on TV. So I think there was some research that was done after 2012, and there was a lot of people with disabilities who were not confident going out with their cane, without a prosthetic, or in a wheelchair. Whereas now it's something that they're actually, proud of almost. It's part of them and who they are, and there's nothing to hide away from it. And just that exposure has helped. And having those role models. There was a story with Johnny Peacock where a young lad in a primary school who wanted to be like Johnny Peacock, and his mum says, well, you're not an amputee. He's like, yeah, so I want to be like Johnny Peacock. And it's really, really kind of empowering.
I think the research you're referring to, Kathryn, was undertaken by Scope in 2012. And yes, 70% it was of their audience and members said it had improved things for them. But since then, hate crime has actually gone up. I think in 2017-18, they were saying by 50% for adults and 100 for children with disabilities, and a particular focus on people with learning needs as well. But I think some of that probably relates to having the confidence to file a complaint and go to the police. I think also some of it might relate to the welfare cuts and the negativity in the media that I can recall there was a lady who claimed to be a wheelchair user and wasn't, and then everyone gets tarred with the same brush, and it's so it's still a big it's a long way to go, as I said at the beginning, about kind of fighting back and breaking down these negative perceptions that actually exist out there still.
So how can sport and heritage help with that, fight, really, isn't it? Those perceptions of people with a disability and the fact that people are doing these hate camps. How can it help?
Well, I think just by sharing the stories, but making sure the stories you share aren't just the superhero. They're about the grassroots people. They're about the person who actually has coached for the last 30 years. In a local community. It's about sharing those stories and getting them out there and getting people to debate them and discuss them. It's about sharing objects. I mean, we have in our collection some baby blades, and it's really interesting. If you've got family groups and you bring out a baby blade, it's not as obvious as an adult blade, and they'll pick it up and they'll look at it and think, oh, well, what is it? And then you'll say, well, that's a baby blade. And we've had two reactions. One is, oh my gosh, that's really fascinating. How's it made? Does it come in different colors? And the other one is, put it down and walk away. And it's because it's different, that people think, well, yeah, I've got a toddler. I don't want a toddler with a blade. And it's, people don't mean to be like that, but actually, by sharing things, you can open up that debate and have those discussions.
Yeah, sorry, what's a baby blade, for my ignorance?
It's a blade for a child with, lost a limb, a lower limb.
Ah, right. Oh, I see, for a limb. Ah, right.
Yeah,
right. It was terminology for me. I had a knife in my hand.
No, sorry. A prosthetic limb for a toddler.
Right, fantastic. Well, exactly. Now I've got where you are, and actually, yes, so important. Sorry, Patrick, I interrupted what you were going to say.
No, I was backing up what Vicky was saying in regards to, I think, learning from history in regards to, so for a really good example is after the London 2012 games, there was a lot of positivity stories, but there was also a lot around Paralympians who were getting disability benefits, and the fact that how can you be a Paralympian and still claim disability benefits? People weren't comprehending, and I think that's partly that whole image of putting athletes and Olympians on pedestals, and the fact that they should all be physically fit, healthy, and that whole process. So I think some of this history and some of this knowledge is in part, I think it's also showing the worst parts of some of these things, because some of these individuals were absolutely hammered. They'd been absolutely inspirational, wonderful people in the newspapers because they'd won gold medals, bronze medals, they'd done all this, and then they were absolutely slammed because they were getting disability benefits and being a Paralympian. And I think sometimes we need to take that learning of understanding a community, and that just because someone does goalball or dance doesn't necessarily mean that they still don't need help and support to do day-to-day living. And I think we don't always take that bit of learning with us when we talk about the heritage of sport and disability specifically, because we want to be so positive and inspirational to people. And sometimes it is that hard learning, like Vicky said, of people that sit there and go, oh, I don't want to look at, I don't want to touch the Beyblade, because they don't understand it. The media portrays a particular area of disability, and we portray a particular area of disability. And I think sometimes history and the work we're pulling together under the Heritage Trust and the work is about showing sometimes the not so nice stuff as well as the positive stuff. To take a good example, it's World War II. The war. When we talk about the war, we don't necessarily talk about always the D-Day landings and that sort of stuff. We always sometimes talk about the concentration camps and the not so nice things. And I think sometimes it's learning from the positive. Positive always works, but you also have to look back at actually what went wrong. What do we need to learn from the areas where it didn't go as right?
And it also relates to what Kathryn said earlier on about understanding the sporting landscape, because there are plenty of Paralympic sports that aren't getting the funding, aren't there? And you know, there's many where people have put their own money into it for years. You know, sledge hockey, for instance. So it's, you know, it's making sure that we share history in a way that makes people understand that landscape.
People always get fixated by the backstory as well, don't they? So before learning about, you know, the goalballer in terms of what they do on court, it's more a case of, well, you know, why are you blind? How did you lose your sight? And it's that kind of fixation on that people want to know, which is sometimes fine, but other times it's like, well, no, let's look at who they are rather than, you know, what they are.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I do think I did notice in this last Paralympics that they were talking not so much about the backstory, but also about who they were as a person, but also about their journey to get there. And I think that was really important to tell that story, because I think, as you've all articulated, the funding doesn't necessarily go to these athletes, and they have to do it on their own. And particularly because of COVID, they had, you know, funding cuts, and it was another year, and some it benefited and some it didn't. And actually learning from that's really important. Patrick?
I think it's also learning that it's learning that idea of the sports again. When people talk about, I don't know about Kathryn, but for us, when we say we're a Paralympic sport, it's like ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. Oh, you must get lots of money from British Paralympic Association. You must be involved in the Commonwealth. You must be getting and it's a case of, well, actually, no. The money generally goes to the people that are going to be in the games. Yes, there are funds from Sport England and UK Sport that go to the grassroots bit, but generally, when you talk about the sports, it's generally those that are in the Paralympic Games area. And I think, again, that misunderstanding that just because it's disability, there should be lots of money there already in the system so we should just click our fingers, stop complaining and get on with the job. And I think probably Kathryn's got the same as I. We've got a number of people that literally they have decided they want to compete, they want to be the best of the best, and to be the best of the best means they have to fundraise, they have to be able to raise the money to be able to get the best equipment, the best coach, the best health support to make sure their bones, their legs, everything's working in the right perspective for them to do the sport correctly. So I think sometimes again it's that understanding of the journey of the individual, and also understanding the industry. Not money doesn't grow on trees, and we as NGBs don't sit there, especially smaller NGBs like us, doesn't sit there and go, oh great, yes, we got a check for £100,000. We've had to write grant applications or run through reels to actually get that. That's not to say that other NGBs don't, but as a smaller NGB, you have to cut the cloth accordingly to decide whether do you support your elites or do you do the grassroots, what's more important at the time, and then how do you keep that middle ground between the two.
Yeah, we're a registered charity. So, you know, yes, we're a national governing body. We get some core funding from Sport England, but we are a registered charity and have to do a lot of that, you know, income generation ourselves, just to things like the equipment. You know, you can't just go down Sports Direct and buy the cheerful stuff. It's, you know, it's specialised equipment, which is expensive. It's like, why? Why does a goalball have to cost £60? No, it's not that kind of expensive to manufacture, but yeah, costs are there. So.
I think the other side of telling the stories, I mean, Julia, you were saying about that, you know, they were given a lot of the journeys of the athletes and up until competing in Tokyo. But I think the other side of it is actually what happens to the Paralympian after their athletic career finishes. And I think some of the stories from that are just as fascinating and equally important to share. And they're so varied and so diverse. And there's also some, you know, fantastic stories how people have gone on to coach, to fundraise, to do charity work. And on the other side of it, you know, Pamela Ralph, she got gold in the rowing in 2012. She's a farmer out in America. You know, it's great, those stories of where people then go on to and what they do, and what their passions are. You know, there were some who might have trained as an artist or a performance before being an athlete, and incredible stories and how they pick that up afterwards. And Robin Sturgeon, who we've been working with recently, you know, he was a swimmer. And actually we've brought him in with his poetry and his music recently to do work with us. So isn't that's great? And those are great stories to share too.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that, you know, that's the educational piece as well, isn't it? Where they can go next, and actually telling those stories is just so important. So one, they've got where they are in the past, and then actually there's a future for them, which I just think is absolutely fascinating. And something just came out, which I'm going to say around my sort of experience in rugby league with the wheelchair team and the women's team, of which I, in my actual role, I looked after both of the international teams, and the cost. If you're you know, a disability team or an individual, there is a lot more cost associated to it, and you've got to put a lot more thought into training and accommodation and all those sort of things that often are hidden. And I think something that, you know, we need to learn from the past is around making sure that things are built into the budgets to be able to accommodate that, so that it is as inclusive as we can possibly make it. Kathryn, you'll probably resonate with that. Yeah,
transport's a massive one for us. You know, if you're registered blind, you don't drive a car. So yeah. Getting to training can be a mammoth. You know, it might only be a couple of miles down the road, but actually planning that journey and, you know, getting the bus, having to get a taxi, it's time and money. So I think there's things you take for granted as a, you know, as a sighted person that actually, you know, for our goalballers, there's a lot more going on day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that resonates quite nicely with a lot of our dancers. We've got one of the groups, we've got 3 individuals, they club together to pay for a taxi that will pick all 3 of them up, but it costs nearly £120 for them to come do a 1-hour dance session. Just because there's no other accessible vehicles around that can take them to and from at that time of night when the class is running. And we've tried to say, right, okay, let's change it at a different time, different locations. But the problem is again, it's having the the space and the time to actually bring those individuals together, that's not going to be expensive across the board. I think there's also that thing of, as a disabled person myself, generally I expect when I go in to buy something, the ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching sign flashes up as I wheel into the room, because it's generally disability more expensive. So I think there is that element of understanding, or getting the community to understand, yes, you can make money from the disability community, you can make money from any of the communities you work with, but is it better to get 50 disabled individuals into a sport and have that funded and at a lower cost, or is it better to have 5 people who are now paying 50 quid to just come along to a session because they're able to raise the money and they're able to fund it? I think this also links back to the care and social care services, because if we can't offer the care and social care services to people to be accessed and engaged in their communities, then you're already defeating the object of what we're trying to do as sport, physical and leisure activity organisations.
And that also comes back to kind of heritage engagement. You know, you need to build into your budgets money that can enable people to be transported and come to you, because it can be incredibly and very easily off-putting in terms of people that you want to engage with won't engage because they're worried about how they will get there and the cost of getting there.
Absolutely, and I think that's really loud and clear. I'm really interested because doing this project, we had a challenge getting, because it was both women and disability, we had a challenge getting the women's histories told, but I think it was an even bigger challenge getting national governing bodies in particular to begin to look at the, you know, the past around heritage. So you're all three obviously involved with disability, but how would you help national governing bodies to be able to represent the elements of their sport that have been disabled and help collect those records?
I think I'll start. I think for me, it's a basis of you've got to start somewhere. And the base for us, the question was, it was a conversation with yourself, Julia, because we came to you and said, we've got a load of videos of competitions, we've got photos, we've got bits and pieces. To take the disability element out of it, it was just for us as an NGB, we had a load of thank you letters, video materials, all that sort of stuff, and going, what do we do with this stuff? It's marvelous, it's great, we love it, but it's been sat in a box for 3 years in the back of one of our offices, because, and I think sometimes it's starting that digging, go back, look at this material and say, what do we want to do with this stuff? Because I think that's what we did as a charity and as a body, was saying, we don't want it to sit in a box in 3 years. I don't want it to just gather dust. I want it to help challenge and champion the message of Paradance UK and the sport and dance in the community. So for us, it was about actually looking at what we did have as a starting block and then building from there. And I think it's not about being afraid to look at what you've got and say, okay, it's too big a monster. Great. Okay, let's just start one box. Pick one box up, start looking at that, then start from there.
I think that I think there's something actually going forward that we could offer to the governing bodies, which is we are developing this completely virtual museum where we can have something about the kind of history and Gutman, but then you'd be able to slot in your own images, films, maybe 3D images of objects, and your own text panels that would then tell your own history, and you'd be able to share that virtually. So that's a way that we could practically look at a project that will really kind of take that forward and help you select some of the objects. And I guess if we apply for funding, you know, assisting you in the curation around some of your objects, because it's better to record something rather than nothing. And I think once you've done that, we operate what we call our virtual volunteers that will do background in the research. They'll also come and help scan things and get them recorded. So, you know, from that, you could build elements of that into it. And I think that would be a great way of just capturing and sharing without it being too big and too daunting and too onerous.
And where would how would they start accessing that, Vicky? Any national governing body that's listening?
Well, it's we've only just started working on it at the moment. But yes, if they email me and say if they're interested, then we can certainly look back. We'll plan to launch it with a toolkit in March next year. And I'd just say contact us and we'll look at what we can do.
Yeah, and we'll put your details in the chat so that people are able to do that. Kathryn, how, from your perspective, how can we sort of dispel these misconceptions about the origins and of disability sport and represent it better?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, we're just trying
Sorry to throw it at you.
Yeah, we're speaking to individuals in the sport currently, and it was like a chain reaction. So we're trying to, even the very, very starting point. So for us, it was an Austrian and a German that did the game initially, but we can't find out any information about them other than the name and the fact that it was Austrian and German. And it was, you know, a rehabilitation exercise that evolved into a formalized sport that became a Paralympic sport. So, you know, we're trying our best to get the story. Then once we've got the story, we just want to tell it to whoever will listen. But yeah, at the moment, it's just kind of step by step, person by person, just trying to get memories and you know, objects from loss at the moment and bringing it all together.
I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's as you say, Kathryn, when I was at a podcast a few weeks ago, the lady from the Riding Disabled Association said the same thing. It was about, there's about 50 different people that have a piece of this puzzle. And it's now trying to link in all those bits to actually get a story together. And I think that's where, again, like yourselves, we're doing the same. We know it was started in dance, was very much started in the 70s, but then it was moved to, we know it was moved to Holland, rejigged, and then linked into Paralympic sports going on from a partnership. But it's finding those key people that has that key bit of information that joins the whole story to make it work. And I think sometimes it's just about a case of building up. We can't actually involve everything and everyone going forward with it. So it's building the story you can so far, which sometimes is about just saying to people, look in the boxes, look in the drawers, tell us what you've got, and then figure out from there.
Our landscape has changed as well, because the origins of the sport in the UK were through blind schools. Now, the majority of blind schools have now gone, whereas our club's now a community club. You know, people go off to, you know, their mainstream school, and you know, they're not linked in as they were previously to, you know, local societies for the blind. So it's not a case of, you know, like a football club that's been around for 100 years. You can try and go back through people and archives. It's almost like there was a full stop, and then the sport came again with the advent of community clubs. So getting back to these blind schools and where they were and who went to them, that's what's really, really hard. Anything kind of pre-internet just doesn't exist. So
I don't think you should worry too much about the detail of the, you know, the distant past. I think just actually looking at your more recent history is completely acceptable and exciting. And you all have people, you know, you've got things in your cupboards, you've got people, you know, who've been involved in years, and actually getting oral histories done is great. And again, we've got an oral history project going on at the moment. If you've got people that you'd like their oral history done, let us know. And I know Ian Britton is watching. I think you are, Ian. You know, we're waiting to hear back from another application for more oral histories to do with Coventry, in collaboration with Coventry University. And again, we'd be able to support you with recording some of those stories.
Yeah, thank you. And we've had a really good comment from Phil Taylor, who's from Warrington Wolves. Hello, Philip. And he's just saying, thinking about physical disability rugby league, which is pretty new to the sport. It's just another question's just come in, so it just flicked up. and they're both new variants of the game. So there's an opportunity to do it from the beginning. And I guess from your perspective, Patrick, that's what you're saying. You know, there's an opportunity to begin to do it and get the stories now and what's actually happening now again, which is what you were saying, Vicky. Don't worry too much about the past, but the pioneers are here and begin to collect them. And I know Warrington Wolves are doing a brilliant job there and beginning to collect them. And I guess that's what they're saying. So a question for Kathryn. From Jess Macbeth. Thank you, Jess, for putting the question in the chat. In the Goalball Heritage Project, is there a difference in the types of artifacts that are kept by players, e.g. less visual artifacts like photographs, scrapbooks, etc.? If so, are there challenges with this? What a fantastic question.
Yeah, I mean, I've got something here actually, I just happened to look at it the day. This is a newsletter from 1986 that I've managed to acquire from someone recently, and it's sometimes people have things but they're not actually sure what they are because they can't see them. I know someone sent me a photograph recently, said it's a trophy, but I don't know when it's from because they couldn't see the engraving on it. So that's what's interesting, when people have actually got things that they think is related to goalball and it's actually something for swimming, or vice versa. It's, you know, something that they're not showing me because it is goalball and don't realise. So yeah, I think that's why we're doing a lot of talking, just trying to speak to people and get memories from heads, because visual references are not as kind of beneficial as such. Having said that, a lot of people have got a lot of useful vision if it's, you know, presented in the right way. So with technology, things can be enlarged or transcribed, things like that. So there are alternative ways. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And we've got another question. Welcome, Brian, from Netball. You'll know him from the Heritage Champions that's been there, who said you might be interested in the work from England Netball. They hold a para netball tournament annually and have a long history of disability netball actually workshops I didn't know about actually in competition. And he's saying that it's one of the first sports in the very first Paralympics at Stoke Mandeville. There is a photograph of the team in the ournetballhistory.org.uk and Ask England Netball at Loughborough. Thank you, Brian, for that. That sounds really fascinating. I mean, does that link with any of the research you've done, Vicky, at Stoke Mandeville, and had you heard about that?
Yes, yes, I was aware of it. And it was netball prior to it being basketball, actually. So it was one of the very early sports, and I can't wait to see the photograph.
Oh, Jim, we can't share it.
We haven't gotten any photographs of it, actually. It tends to be the basketball, so it'd be great to see that. Yeah,
it would be brilliant, wouldn't it? So thank you for that. And I know that sports are beginning, like rugby league, like netball, are beginning to dig a bit deeper, or they have dug a bit deeper about the history as they're collecting the history, which is, and then the links with sport. I know yesterday we were talking about the links of stool ball with cricket and how actually they played on Lords, one of the first games in the early century of stool ball, and it's those links, isn't it, and how it all links to make it sport rather than disabled sport, which I think we've spoken about quite a lot, haven't we? So that's really interesting. And also in the chat, if people want the conference, the Paracoach conference is in the chat as well on the 11th and 12th. So thank you for putting that in there so that they've got the dates of it. Is there anything that any of you want to, that we haven't discussed so far? We've got about 15 minutes before we're due to go off air, that you'd like to sort of discuss a bit further around sort of your collections and what you're doing with disability. Vicky, I'll start with you.
Shall I do the mystery object?
Oh yes, please. Yes, well reminded.
Any thoughts on this? It's quite a beautiful object, actually.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
Lovely.
I dread to think. To me, it looks like a big syringe.
It's not far off, actually. It's actually, I thought I'd show it because it's a medical object. And of course, when the games began, the classification was very medically orientated. And I think it's wonderful to see how we've moved away from that, and we've moved into the focus on the sport and the athlete and not the disability or the medical aspect of it, which is completely right. So it's an example of that journey. This is actually for an enema.
Oh!
But what a beautiful object. And of course, it was very important in terms of the medical advancement and spinal injury in the past. And goes back to that whole thing of equipment and innovation that goes on. And I guess what we've shifted to now is that innovation in terms of equipment and sporting equipment is coming so often still from the athletes themselves. And so I just used that object as an example of that journey shifting and where it might go to next, I guess. So I do know that with Paris 2024, there's going to be a logo that's joint for both the Olympics and the Paralympics, and which is great, a kind of step in the right direction, a step in kind of recognizing the equality between the two. So yes.
Thank you for that. And I think it goes back to this equality, doesn't it, of having a platform where everyone can participate at the level that they want to and be able to join in with sport where they want to be able to do it. And actually that artifact's a really good example, isn't it?
I often draw parallels to women's sport and the steps being made there. I'm embarrassed to admit it, 'cause I'm wearing a red top. I'm a big Everton fan, so I don't like wearing red. But I went to Goodison Park the other week to watch Everton versus Man City, and it was a historic moment, and it was brilliant to see a Premier League game being televised on the BBC. The female officials, female broadcasting team, and a stadium full of predominantly females. And it, for me, I'm jealous. It was mixed emotions. I'm dead jealous that as a 6-7-year-old girl, I didn't have the opportunity that 6-7-year-old girls have got now. But equally, I was kind of proud to be there and part of that moment and think, well, from now on, young girls will have these opportunities and these role models, and the ability to do whatever they want to do in the game, whatever game that is they choose. But yeah, it was quite a powerful moment for me going to it. So.
Yeah, do you know, and I really understand that. I went to a Women's Rugby League Cup final that was, it was a Super League Grand Final. It was only a couple of weeks ago, and they had, I think they had about 5,000 people there that were genuinely going just to watch because it was a final, and whether it was male or female. And I had the similar goosebump moment, also the similar jealous that I was never allowed to throw a rugby ball when I was a girl, but the actual, no, we're moving. And I think we're moving with, I feel that move with disability as well, that there is a real movement towards that inclusion. And when I say inclusion, I mean inclusion as in a really great way, that it included as who they are as individuals and people, and similar to women. And that parallel is really there, I think, particularly within sport. So thank you, Kathryn, definitely. Just to say, Ian Britton's put in the chat that he has some early hours negatives from Stoke Mandeville games. He's a heritage advisor. I don't know if you've seen them, Vicky, but they include netball as well. So after archery, I did the programme in 1949. Wow, that'll be amazing. So that'd be really interesting to see. Patrick, is there anything else from you that you'd like to share that we haven't so far covered?
I think just going back to the conversation you had previously, I think there is an element of we are moving forward. For example, in the dance world, you look at things like Strictly Come Dancing. They had the first female couple last year, and then this year they've got the first male couple. I think in the dance world it's slightly the opposite way around regarding talk about women involved in the dance. It's about engaging more men into the industry, and that opportunity of how it being a ballerina or a ballroom dancer is not seen as being fannying about, or just because you're a male that wants to get involved in that type of activity. So I think it's quite an interesting paradox, because I in the dance world, I'm trying to get more males to come into the industry and see the possibilities and the open opportunities. And that same argument of actually there is a lot of detrimental issues in regards to if you are a male and you're a male dancer in the dance industry. And I think taking Vicky's point around the classification element as well, I think classification and medical classification, without going into a full-on rant, is that there are still a large section around classification in sport that is that elite element that does cause blockages. And I think there is stuff that we can learn to be able to make sports and that classification element more open, or make people understand the wider concept of it, because I don't think we are at the moment. I think we're sweeping it under the carpet and hoping it will go away. And I think that's where the history and the programs can come again and go, actually, the rules are the rules, or these are the processes, but there are other options that can move around that or take it forward into a different direction for you. So I think from Paradance UK's point of view, I think it's a case of we want the voice around movement and dance to be heard in the sports and physical activity industry. It isn't just about the contemporary and the Trinity Labans and the conservatoires and the Royal Opera Houses and all that sort of thing. Yes, they have their element, but there is a large element around movement and dance that fits into sports and fitness and that whole competitive angle that I think we need to challenge and argue and showcase more in the sports industry.
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, and that resonates really a lot with me in my rugby league and dealing with the international rugby league group who were with the wheelchair rugby league, that they want it as close to the running game as possible. So they've chosen not to be an Olympic sport because of that, because they want to be inclusive. And I think that's a really interesting, because they want people who love rugby league to play it as closely as possible. So it's interesting, isn't it, that
fine line, is that very fine line,
yeah, what we'd love to be, you know, Olympic sport. So it is really interesting. From your perspective, Kathryn, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, hopefully people know what goalball is now, which is always our initial aim, and yeah, there'll be more history and more stories coming soon, hopefully, for people.
Oh, absolutely. And there's Steve. I don't know Steve's second name, but thank you and welcome for your comment, Steve, who's just said, and I think really interesting, around expanding the scope of you might not necessarily, as a national governing body, have to expand your scope anymore, because he's flying the flag for walking sport. And I must say, walking rugby league is right up my street. I know I've done it, and it allows so much inclusivity. So within your sports, you can sort of be more inclusive. And he runs one, and he just thinks it's a really good, you know, for everyone to be inclusive. And Vicky, I can see that you're saying that that's a great opportunity for people as well. So thank you. So without further ado, so I don't run over, because we could talk. I knew this would be fantastic, and the hour and a half would absolutely fly by. So thank you, Vicky, Kathryn and Patrick, for absolutely everything. I always learn something from you three whenever I chat to you, and I know the history of disability sport, I have found it absolutely fascinating, but also what's there behind it and what the heritage of sport and the history of sport can bring to now and the future, and what we can learn from, I just think is just so important. And I think we've got that across loud and clear. There's loads in the chat about people, if you want to get in touch with Vicky, Kathryn or Patrick, or if you want to get involved in our national governing body project, linked to this. As a national governing body, there's a toolkit and resources that you can do to also collect heritage. So I'll give a big shout out to that, because I know all national governing bodies I've been working with have found it really useful, and it was launched over this conference toolkit, just to help not be overwhelmed with what we're going to do with all these box of stuff and how we're going to represent it. So thank you, you three. You've made it a really easy hour and a half for me to chair. I've hardly had to say anything, which is wonderful. And thank you for all your questions on the floor. And my next session is in, I think, an hour's time. So I'll see anyone that's tuning into the women's one. And thank you very much for all your three's contribution.